Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to yet another brand new movie review. Now, before I begin, if you're new here, my name is Sean. I do daily movie reviews here on YouTube, and I also post all the streaming availability over on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify for all the audio streaming as well. Now, in today's review, we're going to be doing another movie that came out earlier this year, an earlier summer movie release, and this is going to be for the movie 28 Years Later. Now, this film, basically, to get give an overview of it before I review it, and to give like the history of all of the whole series, because this is one of in my opinion, this is one of those weirder series of movies where it kind of jumps around a ton from the story standpoint and just the overall timeline standpoint of it. But this one individually, to give you stats on it really quick. So again, it came out on June 20th of 2025 as a theatrical release in the U.S. Has a runtime of about an hour and 55 minutes. It was directed by the original director of 28 Days Later, which is going to be Danny Boyle, and it also has once more the original screenwriter of Alex Garland for the story itself as well. Now, what's interesting also about this one for 28 Years Later is that it was also produced also by Cillian Murphy, who is the original star or one of the stars of 28 Days Later back in like 20 years ago. I forget what year it came out, but very, very interesting stuff as far as like the arc of timeline. So before I get into this movie for reviewing it itself, just because it's a very interesting film on its own, again, I wanted to kind of give my thoughts on the overall kind of series of just the whole entire 28 whatever kind of situation, on how these movies kind of came about from what I know of it, and how just the overview of them being released, and even the future of the series, if you want to put it that way too. So back in the day, I think this was I forget what year it was for the actual release of 28 Days Later. Now, 28 Days Later again was a very very small budget. It was shot on film, which in my opinion was really incredibly rad for how the movie looked overall by itself, and it gave the film a very grainy, intentional grainy look from even back then. Because back then, again, this is over 20 years ago now, for 28 Days Later, and it was actually, it's funny because that movie was actually the very first, for me, R-rated movie I ever saw by myself in a theater. So that's how, and I'm in my late 30s now, so it just gives you a time frame of how long it's been, or how long the series has been going on for. Not like they've been releasing movies consistently at all, because it's not like that at all. It's just that they've just, it's just been a long gap of time since they've had other ones come out as well. So again, 28 Days Later came out again over 20 years ago. It also was directed by Danny Boyle, also written for the screen by Alex Garland. So same exact setup as 28 Years Later, same exact, as far as that goes. Now, 28 Years Later does not have Cillian Murphy starring in it. I'll get to that in a few minutes here, or in a minute as well, just to kind of explain what I know about that for the future of the series as well. But again, 28 Days Later again was really kind of for when it came out, at least in my opinion. Again, there was not really, from what I remember back then, a really massive horror genre. And all I mean by that, because horror has always been a thing, it's always been a genre of movies, and or the thriller aspect of it all. So it's not. So I'm not trying to downplay that part of this series, but what I want to say is that the way that 28 Days Later came across and was released, and the type of horror movie that it is very very different than any other horror movie or horror genre style of film, because it is not a zombie movie, or a zombie series, I should say, for that matter. It is not meant to be that way, and that's what makes it really that. In my opinion, that's what gives it the edge over everything else that is compared to, because you can't really compare it to any other style of horror, because it's not like anything else. So, long story short, because all of the films in the series, if you can call it that, they all have the same kind of base overtone, if you will, of what the entire storyline is going to be. And then each individual film that's come out since 28 Days Later has a basic, like a switch around of not only time frame that it's in and it's giving the story up, but also of just the family that's in it, or the group of people that are starring in it, as well as where they're at. I mean, they're all in the UK. It's all based off of, for the most part, an English infection based out of the UK is where the whole entire source of everything happens, for the most part, of across the entire board. So that doesn't change. But what's interesting about 28 Days Later, that which I'll review fully on its own, because it's going to be, that's a whole other thing. But again, what's interesting about 28 Days Later is the fact that again, story wise, for the source story, is that it's a rage viral infection. That is what the very very first scene of 28 Days Later is that this group of I'm assuming kind of like animal rights activists. They don't really ever get explained, even from all the research I did like years ago on 28 Days Later. But basically, this group of animal rights activists break into this observatory, and they find these chimpanzees in a locked up in cages, and literally being basically forced to watch ultra aggressive rage of just on a constant rolling basis of TV on TVs above them. And it's just like, and they show everything. Like these movies are very raw, they're very gory, they're very bloody, they're very intense, and that's why they kind of really kind of reset or kind of reinvigorated like what a horror movie could be in a sense, to me at least. And that first scene really in itself kind of tells, at least in my opinion, like it just tells an entirely different story than any other horror movie I've ever seen, let alone a series. Because again, the whole opening scene is just they find these chimpanzees that are being as a scientist in that scene explains it very very quickly. He says that they are given an inhibitor of reactant to a rage virus that they created in a lab, basically. And then what happens is one of these animal rights activists in the first film, they're there to basically break them out and help them as far as like animal rights and break them out. And they do that. They open the cage, and then one of the chimpanzees goes and and charges at the girl in the first film, and she gets infected, and she's like ground zero number one and patient number one kind of thing, and that's where it begins, and it blacks out and kicks in 28 days later, and then you open up to Cillian Murphy's character, and the story goes on from there. Now again, these are not horror movies. I mean, I'm sorry, I should say they're not zombie movies. What I'm saying, they're not zombie movies. The infected in all the films across the series do look like zombies, but if you look at a zombie movie, or I should say the average typical run of the mill zombie movie, they're very slow. They're very kind of they're very weak, and they're very undead but dead. So the best kind of example I can give of that would be like any episode ever of The Walking Dead is what a zombie movie is. That's what the whole story is for The Walking Dead for the most part, is that they're zombies. But again, these are not zombies. These are very much, they are virally infected by a rage virus. They are infected by that, but they are not human anymore. So they have that inhibit the infected have this inhibitor of rage, and it's a never ever ending rage that is basically just from what I've learned about it over the years of seeing all the movies and all that and learning about the whole process of how it's written, that whenever they get around humans or other animals even, they get aggressive and they want to go tear them apart because they're again filled with rage. That's the whole point of the whole entire story of the source of it all. Now, jumping forward to the new one, which is 28 years later. Now, again, all of them, the entire series is a whole. Again, they're all told on very different time frames, different timelines, with different families doing different things and all that kind of stuff. So there's 28 Days Later. Then the sequel to that, which is 28 Weeks Later, has none of the original cast and crew from 28 Days Later. So Cillian Murphy, Naomi Harris, all of them. The original cast is gone. It's a whole new cast, and it includes kids for the first time. It includes some American actors, so like Jeremy Renner, back when he was before his whole Marvel blow up, so to speak. For Jeremy Renner, he's in it as a American, I think like Navy SEAL sniper in 28 Weeks Later. And that in that movie, they're kind of reopening the UK 28 weeks after the infection occurs because they deem it to be safe. Then of course it never is safe, and then all hell breaks loose, so to speak, in that movie as well, doing the same kind of stuff. And that also has Robert Carlyle in that one as well, and he's pretty much the primary character. And then he pretty much reopens the gates to from what they are hoping to have as a safe and healthy reopening of the UK, and he breaks that with because he meets his wife, blah 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 blah. So, and again, I'll do all reviews on all those individually at a later time. But again, that's a different movie. It's just it's the same source story of 28 Days Later again, but then again it's expanded to again a bigger, broader audience of a different family, different people, different everything like that. And then of course after that nothing happened. After 28 weeks later, nothing occurred for movie wise, for release wise, for a very very long time, like decades essentially. And then what was weird is that about from the current now standpoint, 2025, what was weird is that about I remember reading as far as like even like almost 2 years ago now that Danny Boyle, Alex Garland, again, writer director, both of them, and then Cillian Murphy all kind of came together and were kind of re-inspired, I guess is the best phrase for it, a word for it, to start a new to continue on with this story, and that they had some cool original concepts, or so that's what they said in some interviews a couple years ago. Now, what's interesting to me about 28 Years Later is that this first trailer, because again, I've loved this series, all of them. I love them all individually for different reasons, overall. And actually, 28 Days Later is what introduced me to Cillian Murphy as an actor, and I've been pretty much following him as an actor ever since that role because I loved him in 28 Days Later, and I've been again watching him and everything he's done since then. For the most part, is not everything he does is in the U.S. Because he's not American, so makes sense. But moving on. So again, 28 Years Later. Again, I guess it was a couple years ago that again Danny Boyle, Alex Garland, and Cillian Murphy got together, and again were re-inspired a little bit for a new story. They wanted to revitalize the series, and they actually ironically got a big studio, which is I believe Sony in this case, to believe in the story this time because again the original ones were not a big budget release at all. They were done on film. They were done on very very limited budgets for what they had. And they made a lot of money. They did for what they were. And then nowadays to the modern series of what they are. I guess pretty much from what I read about is that Danny Boyle, again the director, went to Sony or Sony went to him, whatever it was, and pretty much he pitched with Alex Garland, the writer of the stories. He pitched them on a brand new trilogy. So the first of the trilogy, which is again 3 movies, is 28 Years Later, which is out, came out in June, and then coming out in January of 2026 will be the follow-up to 28 Years Later, which is going to be 28 Years Later with the title attached to it of The Bone Temple. And what's interesting about that film, from what I've read about it so far, is that it will have the introduction or reintroduction, if you will, of Cillian Murphy's character as he is now later on. That's all that's been given about it. And even just about a week ago, like a week and a half ago, or even a few days ago, the first trailer came out for 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, and Ralph Fiennes, I'm probably messing his name up, but Ralph Fiennes, who was in 28 Years Later as a doctor, as a physician, he's seeked help from the kid in the movie, and he is basically being shown, it looks like so far at least, as a primary character, at least somewhat, one of them, in 28 Years Later, the Bone Temple, and it goes from there. And then the final one in the trilogy, which is going to be I think in a year after January 2026, will be the finality of everything, and that's supposed to heavily involve acting wise Cillian Murphy, at least him, and he's the only one that's been announced for it yet, so to speak, right now. And that's what Danny Boyle has spoken to when he did some red carpet interviews for the first 28 Years Later film, is that he's like, yeah, Cillian Murphy is heavily involved. He's a producer on all 3 of them, and that they were basically way ahead of time in filming all of them to get them done and get them out basically as soon as possible, like from a studio standpoint. So that's kind of the timeline. Again, it was 28 Days Later first came out. Then like a year or two later, I believe it was 28 Weeks Later came out. Different story, but same source story. And then 20 years later, whatever reason, I think it was, or maybe 10 years later, 28 Years Later came out, and now we have a new trilogy. Now, here's where I'll get into the actual review. And the reason why I wanted to give all that out first is because, again, all these movies, no matter which one you watch, they're all different families, different experiences, different stories, but they're all based off of the same source story of the original from 28 Days Later. And that's very, very important to discuss in its own, which is why I did that, because if you haven't seen at least the first one, which the majority of humanity I feel like has, that loves this series as much as I do, or just in general. But again, the source story is explained and given a great deal of information and explained in the first one of 28 Days Later, and towards the end of it too is kind of like more of an expansion of what really happens, sort of, and essentially as far as from within the UK and all that stuff as far as that goes too. Now, on to 28 Years Later for the actual review. Now, again, when I saw this, or I guess I should say when I read or saw all the articles that were kind of like hinting at this whole new series being officially made, I was very, very stoked. But I was more stoked because I found out that it was Cillian Murphy producing and acting in some of them. But it was also mainly because of the fact that it was Danny Boyle and Alex Garland, because those two together make some of the best films ever for horror, at least for the most part, in my opinion. And they always kind of like leave you wanting more. And they're just very, very gifted people when it comes to being artists for these kind of movies, especially for this series as well. So that's kind of my just I was excited. I was super, super excited just because I love this whole series. I think that they're all very, very good movies. Um, and they all tell very different stories, each on their own individually, but they're all very, very good as well, and they're all very raw too. Like that's what's cool about this whole series is that 28, whichever one you watch, they're all very raw horror movies. They're all very visceral, and even though the stories are all very different from who you're seeing the story or the experience from, they're still done in the same kind of I can't say the cinematography or directed way in a sense too, and that's kind of what leads me into 28 years later of what just came out in June. So I saw hints of it being made, and then I saw that they were making the first one, and it was kind of made quickly. I feel like for what it was. And what's crazy about that is that because when the 28 years later first movie, this first one that's out, when it's when the trailers came out for it, again, the trailers were done very, very, very in a very clever way, and because they didn't give out really any information about the story, it really just kind of gave you a little glimpse of who was even in it, as far as like Aaron Taylor Johnson, this new kid who's in it, as far as his character, which and he's who is he? He is Alfie Williams. It's got also Ralph Fiennes, of course, as one of the like, who comes on later in the movie, and then of course Jodie Comer and a few other people as well. But those are the primary actors in it, and they're all for the most part, I believe they're all British as well, or English, whatever it might be. So again, I love all that with it too. And what's cool about this movie when I saw it, because again the trailers came out, and then they gave away almost no information about the movie. It was just a very heavy, intense trailer. It showed a lot of infected in it, but what was crazy about the trailer for the 28 years later for the first one, because there was only two trailers that came out for this movie when it came before the theatrical release, and what was crazy to me at least was that the infected looked different in the trailer. They were very paced. They were almost a little bit more in control than in the previous films, and they were bigger. So you could definitely tell that even though this is like 28 years after the initial infection, that the infection had really evolved to a new one, and that is explained a little bit in detail in the film itself, if you actually watch it. But that's what really took me by surprise, and that's also one of the reasons why I love Danny Boyle as a director and a storyteller, because even though Alex Garland wrote these ones at least and wrote 28 Days Later, the way that Danny Boyle can capture a scene and have it be horror but not have any blood or gore in it is really one of his best traits as a director, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is that there's a scene in the trailer, which is also in the movie, but in the trailer of where it's a low ground shot up a hill basically to it with a one tree, I believe it is, or like a few trees which and it's shot like from like with a shadow of a foreshadow on there, and there's like probably like 10 or 15 infected. They're at the top of the hill essentially, and they're not running or moving really. They're just standing there, and and you can't see them. Like you can't see their faces, you can't see their bodies. You see just their overall outlines of who they are as humans basically. And what's crazy is how they aren't moving. Like, they're very stoic. They're very just they're huge. They're huge. In fact, they're big dudes and big people, I should say. But they don't move much. They're just kind of standing there, and there's no context given because it's a trailer to what's happening in the story at that point. But just Danny Boyle's or whoever edited the trailer, but just Danny Boyle's his ability to show that scene and have it look as scary as it does or as it did in the trailer is one of the coolest, scariest, very craziest things that I've seen in a long time in a trailer, because it scares you and it's very intense for what it is, and it's a very surreal surreal thing just to see. There's not even like there's no blood, there's no gore, there's nothing like that in the actual in that part of the scene, but it's still a scary scene, and that is what makes, to me at least, that's what makes the whole entire 28 everything a very scary and intense horror story overall, is because you don't really see this story, or at least I don't really see the story as a zombie thing. I mean, it's not a zombie thing anyways, but I'm saying like it's a very, I'd say, far more realistic possibility of what can actually happen if some scientists in some country made a really crazy aggressive virus on accident and it got released somehow. It could possibly happen. That's what scares, and that's the whole entire part of the source story of 28 Days Later. That's really scary to see in a movie in a sense, because it's like it could possibly happen. You never know. So that's kind of like how I feel about the trailers. So again, the trailers came out, two of the trailers came out, and then again the movie came out, and again I saw that. Again, I saw it opening weekend. I was very very stoked for it to see it, and what was weird to me about the movie is this. So it's a little over runtime wise. It's 1 hour 55 minutes. So again, it's not a short movie, but it's a pretty average. I would say the average horror movie length for what it is, almost 2 hours. And the story kind of has two parts to it, in my opinion, because it's got the beginning like hour or so with the kid Alfie Williams, is his character, and he plays the son, and then you've got Aaron Taylor Johnson as his dad, and then Jodie Comer is the wife of them, and the parents with Aaron Taylor Johnson. And what was interesting about the movie, the opening of the movie, is that they kind of back it up to when Aaron Taylor Johnson is a kid for a brief, quick scene, and it's the very beginning of the film, and that what's weird about that is that scene has a 28 days later tag on it before it kicks in, the same way that the original 28 days later movie had as well. So basically, story-wise, they're saying that Aaron Taylor Johnson's character in the beginning of 28 years later is that he's a kid at the beginning of the infection, and then again, and then it goes really really bad in that part, and then it blacks out, and then it says 28 years later. So he's obviously an adult in the movie, and he's the father of the kid, and then so. But I thought it was a very interesting storyline to have them include Aaron Taylor Johnson as far as his story, like his character story, being part of, in some ways, the original 28 Days Later movie without him being in it at all, obviously. But his character was still, there as a kid when that first movie came out, and then of course he grows into becomes an adult, and then now he's the adult in 28 years later with his own son. And basically, the movie, again, I encourage you to go see it if you haven't seen it, obviously. But it's interesting because the first half of the movie is really showing how far, I feel like, in my opinion at least, how far the infection has not gotten any better. There still really isn't any much of a better world, at least in the UK, because they don't show anything outside of the UK. Like the whole entire series, they have some brief moments throughout the entire series where they kind of mention outside of the UK, outside of England, but not a lot. For the most part, it all takes place in the same country, but different places, and you get to see different parts of England throughout all of the films as well, but not a huge discussion or a huge newsworthy of anything that really goes on outside of what's happening outside the world besides that country. So I find that very interesting too. But again, probably half the movie of this one is the fact that it kind of just shows like daily life of what the family is dealing with, because again they're in a small kind of village area, and basically the whole story point is where, like, again, the kid who's Alfie Williams, who is the son of Aaron Taylor Johnson, of how he is going with his dad on like their first kind of like voyeuristic hunting trip outside of their own little area, which includes like the walking across the big stretch of lands, where they kind of premise it in the movie as like, okay, well, once you go out there, you are on your own basically, like you're completely on your own. And it's interesting to me because in the movie, like once it gets going and all that kind of stuff, like once they actually go out across the lands and then start like, kind of looking for infected and to teach Alfie Williams' character how to kill the infected and how they look and just how to watch them and how to kind of track them down. Like that's where it gets kind of like more into the horror part of it a little bit, and the story kind of goes from there. And at that point in the movie, I was it kept my interest for sure. Like it was definitely like it felt like a 28 whatever kind of movie for the style of it, how it was filmed, and the story that was happening too. And once they get some infected after them a little bit, and they have to escape it for their part of the story. That's where it gets really interesting as far as like just how that kind of works out story wise, because again, it turns into a very gory, bloody movie at that point. But then what's weird is that at that point in the story, because then Alfred Williams' character of the kid, when they get back, he asks Aaron Taylor Johnson, his dad, he asks him how about Jodie Comer, which is his mom in the story, and because she's kind of sick in the film, or she is sick, I should say, like at least mentally speaking, and he asks why she doesn't get any better, and why his dad doesn't seem to care about her much at all, and he asks because in the story like they give like a little bit of a hint as well about a doctor being in their land area as well because they see a fire when they're outside their own little village, and he tells his son that there's a doctor out there, but they don't really seek his help anymore because he's kind of lost his mentality, which turns out to be Ralph Fiennes' character. But what's crazy is that once Alfred Williams' character sees his dad with another woman at a bonfire, he like loses trust him, loses faith in him, and doesn't trust him anymore. So he gets his mom, which is Jodie Comer, and they cross over the land essentially on their own, and because he wants to help his mom to get her diagnosed basically with whatever she's going on with mentally. And then that introduces Ralph Fiennes' character and about how he's a doctor. And what's crazy about this part of the movie is that this is where the whole movie kind of switches up a little bit, because at that point you kind of like this kid kind of becomes, I don't want to say an adult, but he kind of grows up very very fast, but in front of your eyes, as far as like showing how much of a caretaker he can be for his mother, and how he can really take care of her even with all these infected people coming around him and trying to and basically taking care of them by killing them and all that stuff like that. And then once they get up to Ralph Fiennes' character and meet him and ask him for help, which he does help them, and then he tells them basically that his mom, like he's like, well, he's like, I can't really, actively diagnose her. I'm not a behavioral health specialist, but he basically can tell as a doctor that she has cancer and that she doesn't have very much time left. And then what's weird is that they go into this area of all these bones, and which is now called from the next movie of the sequel called the Bone Temple. And basically that whole entire area is like all these all the people that have died and from being infected, and then Ralph Fiennes' character then takes care of them, burns them basically, and puts all their bones into stacks, and it becomes this really massive kind of like a graveyard in a really interesting way, honestly, for that part, for what it is as well. And from there, basically the kid Alfie like kind of says goodbye to his mom, and then she goes along with Ralph Fiennes, and then basically he gives her, I think, a shot, and she's gone basically, and then the kid kind of buries her within that temple area too. And to really to explain how I feel about this, to finish it off really for this moment at least, is that I feel like there's kind of like two different stories going on, because when at that point in the story, then Alfie again, he doesn't have his mom, she's gone, and so her story is pretty much over. But then he goes back to the village he comes from because his dad's still there. He leaves a note saying that he's fine and he's gonna go searching for other things, and he'll come back when he's ready to. And that drives Aaron Taylor Johnson crazy, rightfully, because he's the dad. And that's where I feel like almost like the story kind of gets weird, because then it goes to the final few scenes of the film where Alfie is on his character is on his own, and he's eating, and then all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, this group of like Adidas tracksuit wearing guys with all blonde hair kind of show up, and some infected are coming at Alfred Williams' character, and they kind of like have like a weird like almost like a not Mortal Kombat, like they have a weird like kind of like a Power Ranger scene where they kill the infected, but in a really weird way, and it just. And the weird thing to me about, and the reason why and again, so for my review of itself, of the movie itself, I liked 28 Years Later but only because of the previous films that I love more. So for me, this film on its own, without seeing sequels that are coming soon and all that, if it was released by itself as a movie, I don't think I would have liked the movie at all, because really they're really kind of, I feel like, seeding the movie off of you knowing or seeing or assuming you've already seen at least 28 Days Later and having all the knowledge of that film, and building off that film with this one as well. But I feel like it's just not very well done as far as like in a way too, and I'll try to explain that. So basically, what I mean is that I feel like so one of my favorite things about Danny Boyle as a storyteller, as a director, I should say, is that he does get great performances out of his actors or actresses all across the board. Every movie I've ever seen him do for directing, he gets great performances out of everyone that's in them. He also has a great way of shooting very beautiful, scary but beautiful scenes as well, and I love all that too from his perspective of how he shows things that can be with no blood and no gore, but still be very, as I said before, can still be very scary, very intimidating, very like threatening looking, but having them still be beautifully shot. And that's a very hard thing to do for any director, I feel like. But the opposite side of him as a movie maker, or as a filmmaker for me, is that I feel like he adds in things in the movies that just don't need to be there at all. And the best example I can give of that, actually two examples, is the final scene of the movie, which is again this group of people that come in there and they're dressed up in like in Adidas tracksuits, and they kind of have like a weird, again, like a Power Ranger scene, and they kind of kill the infected in their own way, and it's just weird. And they invite him along as Alfred Williams to go to the next film, basically, of whatever happens next in the story. And that was just a weird ending. It was just weird. It was just weird. I didn't expect it. I didn't really care for it. I kind of whatever. It was like, okay, well, the whole rest of the movie previously was pretty good for story wise, but that was just weird. And then the other part of it is just if you've seen it, you probably know what I'm talking about. But there's a very big infected guy in the movie. They call which Ralph Fiennes' character calls him the Alpha. And I'm not gonna dive too far into what he looks like, but I will just say that there is a part of this Alpha infected character that's very prominently shown way too much in the movie that I think is very unnecessary, and it kind of it doesn't ruin the movie, but it kind of takes away from like how good the story was before he got into the film as a infected character. And for me for me personally, like with how much I enjoyed everything up to that point, I was just like when I saw it, and when I saw how much his his thing was shown in the film, I was just like, why does that have to be in the film? Why? And it's just one of those things where and the weird thing is that Danny Boyle as a director does this in a lot of his films, where he will weirdly put things in the movies that don't need to be there, and they don't make the story any better. They don't make the story any more interesting. They don't do any benefits to the movie. But every movie he does, I feel like, and it's the only thing I like that I get weirded out about him as a movie maker, is that he always has one or two things in every movie he does that are just not necessary. And that was definitely like one of the bigger ones. I was like, why is this guy or this part of this guy in this movie with so much visceral, visual representation of his thing? And what's already worrying to me about this is that in the new trailer for the sequel for this whole thing, for the Bone Temple one, that this same infected guy, this Alpha, is also again in the movie trailer already. So I'm very curious as to why he's in there so much, and why it's done that way. And what makes me curious too is because um, there was an interview with Alex Garland and with Danny Boyle before the 28 Years Later movie came out, and the interviewer had already seen the movie, and it was before it was released to a wide audience, so I hadn't seen it yet. And basically, the interviewer guy was like, he kind of mentioned that scene a little bit, and I didn't know what he was talking about yet, but now I do. But he mentioned that scene, and he was just like, "Why did you guys include that? Why was it? Why?" He was like basically like, "Why were some of these things so prominently shown when they didn't need to be?" And the only thing that Alex Garland said at all was that he's like, "Well, for the time being, for now, just know that these are three films that are all tied together, and you'll know why." So maybe there's a massive reason why this infected alpha guy, alpha infected, is so prominently shown with his body. I'll put it that way. And again, I don't get it. Maybe it'll make more sense in the second film for the Bone Temple, or even in the third one. But for now, I just don't know. So again, overall, the 28 Years Later movie, great overall story for the most part. I like how all the characters were interacting with each other. All of them did great acting performances. Again, from Jodie Comer, Alfred Williams, Ralph Fiennes, Aaron Taylor Johnson, all of them, the entire main cast. They brought it. They did a great job. All the action scenes were super well done. I loved how they shot the infected shots, as far as just the running parts, and it was crazy because they were all shot with iPhones for the most part. So a lot of the close-ups, so to speak, were all done with iPhones. Or it was like a circular wooden thing that they made, they custom made for the movie, and it had like 10, 20 iPhones, and they filmed it all like that, and it's really cool for that too, from a visual technology standpoint too. So that was really rad as well, and it was just a very beautiful, scary but beautiful film from a coloration standpoint and how they filmed it too. So would I recommend it to you guys? As far as if you haven't seen it already, I would say if you want to watch this whenever you have any interest in 28 Years Later, definitely go back to the first source stories, I call it, which is 28 Days Later. Watch that one even a few times to really gain the very beginnings and basis of the source of the story, because that movie really explains it the best. And again, 28 Days Later, in my opinion, is obviously why the rest of this entire series even exists, and why it was continued to be made and produced as films, because again, they're all good in their own rights, and they all have different perspectives of different things happening throughout the entire source story, which is cool. But again, I feel like we'll see what happens with 28 years later, The Bone Temple. I'm very curious about how it'll be moved forward from how the first one ended, because again, the first one ended very weirdly, in my opinion. So would I recommend them? Of course I would. I'll see them no matter what. I see whatever Danny Boyle directs and all that stuff, even though he's not directing the next one, which is kind of sad, but whatever. So again, that's kind of my overall review of this film. It was, for the most part, what I expected of it. It was a little bit weird at some points, where certain things did not need to be in the film, in my opinion, unless they are very unless they are explained or detailed for their purpose later on in the series, and we'll see about that. And when that comes, that's the hard part about these trilogies, of when it's already a guaranteed trilogy, that the things are spaced out on purpose, and it kind of doesn't always make sense right away. But whatever. So if you have seen this movie, or if you've seen all of them, let me know which ones you like the most or the least. Let me know about which ones you like or dislike. If you liked or disliked the certain parts of 28 Years Later, let me know as well. And as always, thanks for watching. Thank you for listening. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for all the daily movie reviews I do here. And again, I will be doing a review for every individual one of these films, because they are all great films overall. But again, thanks for watching and thanks for listening. I'll see you guys all in the next movie review.